Days before order came to Lonesome Dove, when Captain Call and Augustus were still rangers, with responsibilities that took them up and down the border. Jake Spoon was a ranger too, and in Newt's eyes, the most dashing of them all. He always carried a pearl-handled pistol and rode a pacing horse. Easier on the seat, Jake claimed. The dangers of his profession seemed to sit lightly on him. But then the fighting gradually died down along the border, and the captain, Mr. Gus, and Jake, P.I., and Dietz all quit rangering and formed the Hat Creek outfit. But the settled life seemed not to suit Jake. One day he was just gone. No one was surprised, though Newt's mother was so upset by it for a time, he got a whipping every time he asked when Jake was coming back. The whippings didn't seem to have much to do with him, just with his mother's disappointment that Jake had left. Newt stopped asking about Jake, but he didn't stop remembering him. It was barely a year later that his mother died of fever, and the captain and Augustus took him in. Although at first they argued about him. First, Newt missed his mother so much that he didn't care about the arguments. His mother and Jake were both gone, and arguments were not going to bring him back. But when the worst pain passed, and he began to earn his keep around the Hat Creek outfit by doing the numerous chores that the captain had set him, he often drifted back in his mind to the days when Jake Spoon had come to see his mother. It seemed to him that Jake might even be his father, though everyone told him his name was Newt Dobbs, not Newt Spoon. Why it was Dobbs, and why everyone was so sure, was a puzzle to him, since no one in Lonesome Dove seemed to know anything about a Mr. Dobbs. It had not occurred to him to ask his mother while she was alive. Last names weren't used much around Lonesome Dove, and he didn't realize that the last name was supposed to come from the father. Even Mr. Gus, who would talk about anything, seemed to have no information about Mr. Dobbs. "He went west when he shouldn't have," was his only comment on the man. Newt had never asked Captain Call to amplify that information. The captain preferred to volunteer what he wanted you to know. In his heart, though, Newt didn't believe in Mr. Dobbs. He had a little pile of stuff his mother had left, just a few beads and combs and a little scrapbook and some cut-out pictures from magazines that Mr. Gus had been kind enough to save for him. And there was nothing about a Mr. Dobbs in the scrapbook and no picture of him amid the pictures. Though there was a scratchy picture of his grandfather, Maggie's father, who had lived in Alabama. If, as he suspected, there had been no Mr. Dobbs, or if he had just been a gentleman who stopped at the rooming house a day or two, they had lived in the rooming house when Maggie was alive, then it might be that Jake Spoon was really his father. Perhaps no one had informed him of it because they thought it more polite to let Jake do so himself when he came back. Newt had always assumed that Jake would come back, too. Scraps of news about him had blown back down the cow trails. Word that he was a peace officer in Ogallala, or that he was prospecting for gold in the Black Hills. Newt had no idea where the Black Hills were, or how you went about finding gold in them, but one of the reasons he was eager to head north with a cow herd was the hope of running into Jake somewhere along the way. Of course, he wanted to wear a gun and become a top hand and have the adventure of the drive. Maybe they would even see a buffalo, though he knew there weren't many left. But underneath all his other hopes was the oldest yearning he had, one that could lie covered over for months and years and still be fresh as a toothache, the need to see Jake Spoon. Now the very man was riding toward them, right there beside his Dietz on a pacing horse as pretty as the one he had ridden away 10 years before. Newt forgot Dish Bogat, whose every move he had been planning to study. Before the two riders even got very close, Newt could see Dietz's big white teeth shining in his black face, for he'd gone away on a routine job and was coming back proud of more than having done it. He didn't race his horse up to the porch or do anything silly, but it was plain, even at a distance, that Dietz was a happy man. Then the horses were kicking up little puffs of dust in the wagon yard, and the two were almost there. Jake wore a brown vest and a brown hat. He still had his pearl-handled pistol. Dietz was still grinning. They rode right up to the back porch before they drew rein. It was obvious that Jake had come a long way, for the pacing bay had no flesh on him. Jake's eyes were the color of coffee, and he wore a little mustache. He looked them all over for a moment and then broke out in a slow grin. "Howdy, boys," he said. "What's for breakfast?" "Why, biscuits and fatback, Jake," Augustus said. "The usual fare, only we won't be serving it up for about 24 hours. I hope you got a buffalo liver or a haunch of venison on you to tide you over." "Gus, don't tell me that you've et," Jake said, swinging off the bay. "We rode all night, and Dietz couldn't think of nothing to talk about except the taste of them biscuits you make." "While you was talking, Gus was eating 'em," Call said. He and Jake shook hands, looking one another over. Jake looked at Dietz a minute. "I knowed we should have telegraphed from Pickles Gap," he said, then turned with a grin and shook Gus's hand. "You always was a hog, Gus," Jake said. "And you were usually late for meals," Augustus reminded him. Then P.I. insisted on shaking hands, though Jake had never been very partial to him. "By gosh, Jake, you stayed gone a while," P.I. said. While they were shaking, Jake noticed the boy standing there by some lank cowhand with a heavy mustache. "My Lord," he said. "Are you little Newt? Why, you're plumb growed. Who let that happen?" Newt felt so full of feeling that he could hardly speak. "It's me, Jake," he said. "I'm still here." "What do you think, Captain?" Dietz asked, handing Call a receipt from the bank. "Did I find the prodigal?" "You found him," Call said. "I bet he wasn't in church either." Dietz had a laugh at that. "No, sir," he said. "Not in church." Jake was introduced to Dish Boget, but once he shook hands, he turned and had another look at Newt, as if the fact that he was nearly grown surprised him more than anything else in Lonesome Dove. "I swear, Jake," Augustus said, looking at the bay horse, "you've rode that horse right down to the bone." "Give him a good feed, Dietz," Call said. "I judge it's been a while since he's had one." Dietz led the horses off toward the roofless barn. It was true that he made his pants out of old quilts for reasons that no one could get him to explain. Colorful as they were, quilts weren't the best material for riding through mesquite and chaparral. Thorns had snagged the pants in several places, and cotton ticking was sticking out. For headgear, Dietz wore an old cavalry cap he'd found somewhere. It was in nearly as bad a shape as Lippy's bowler. "Didn't he have that cap when I left?" Jake asked. He took his own hat off and slapped the dust off his pants leg with it. He had curly black hair, but Newt saw to his surprise that there was a sizable bald spot on the top of his head. "He found that cap in the 50s, to the best of my recollection," Augustus said. "You know, Dietz is like me. He's not one to quit on a garment just because it's got a little age. We can't all be fine dressers like you, Jake." Jake turned his coffee eyes on Augustus and broke out another slow grin. "What'd it take to get you to whip up another batch of them biscuits?" he said. "I've come all the way from Arkansas without tasting a good bite of bread." "From the looks of that pony, it's been fast traveling," Call said, which was as close to prying as he intended to get. He had run with Jake Spoon off and on for 20 years and liked him well, but the man had always worried him a little underneath. There was no more likable man in the West, and no better rider either, but riding wasn't everything, and neither was likableness. Something in Jake didn't quite stick. Something wasn't quite consistent. He could be the coolest man in the company in one fight and in the next be practically worthless. Augustus knew it too. He was a great sponsor of Jake's and had stayed fond of him, although for years they were rivals for Clara Allen, who eventually showed them both the door. But Augustus felt, with Call, that Jake wasn't long on backbone. When he left the Rangers, Augustus said more than once that he would probably end up hung. So far, that hadn't happened, but riding up at breakfast time on a gant horse was an indication of trouble. Jake prided himself on pretty horses, and would never ride a horse as hard as the bay had been ridden if trouble wasn't somewhere behind him. Jake saw Bolivar coming from the old cistern with a bucket full of water. Bolivar was a new face, and one that had no interest in his homecoming. A little cool water sloshed over the edges of the bucket, looking very good to a man with a mouth as dusty as Jake's. "Boys, I'd like a drink and maybe even a wash, if you can spare one," he said. "My luck's been running kind of muddy lately, but I'd like to get water enough in me that I can at least spit before I tell you about it." "Why, sure," Augustus said. "Go fill the dipper. You want us to stay out here and hold off the posses?" "There ain't no posses," Jake said, going in the house. Dish Bogut felt somewhat at a loss. He had been all ready to hire on, then this new man rode up, and everyone had sort of forgotten him. Captain Call, a man known for being all business, seemed a little distracted. He and Gus just stood there as if they expected a posse, despite what Jake Spoon had said. Newt noticed it too. Mr. Gus ought to go in and cook Jake some biscuits, but he just stood there, thinking about something, evidently. Dietz was on his way back from the lots. Dish finally spoke up. "Captain, like I said, I'd be glad to wait if you have some plans to make up a herd," he said. Captain looked at him strangely, as if he might have forgotten his name, much less what he was doing there, but it wasn't the case. "Why, yes, Dish," he said. "We might be needing some hands if you don't mind doing some well digging while you wait. P, you best get the boys started."
Yep.
Dish was almost ready to back out then and there. He had drawn top wages for the last 2 years without being asked to do anything that couldn't be done from a horse. It was insensitive of the captain to think that he could just order him off with a boy and an old idiot like P.I. to wrestle a spade and a crowbar all day. It scratched his pride, and he had a notion to go get his horse and let him keep their well digging. But the captain was looking at him hard. When Dish looked up to say he had changed his mind, their eyes met, and Dish didn't say it. There had been no real promises made, much less talk of wages, but somehow Dish had taken one step too far. The captain was looking at him eye to eye, as if to see if he was going to stand by his own words, or if he meant to wiggle like a fish and change his mind. Dish had only offered to stay because of Lori, but suddenly it had all gotten beyond her. P and Newt were already walking toward the barn. It was clear from the captain's attitude that unless he wanted to lose all reputation, he had trapped himself into at least one day's well digging. It seemed to him he ought to at least say something to salvage a little pride, but before he could think of anything, Gus came over and clapped him on the shoulder. "You should have rode off last night, Dish," he said with an irritating grin. "You may never see the last of this outfit now." "Well, you was the one that invited me," Dish said, highly annoyed. Since there was no help for it short of disgrace, he started for the lots. "If you come to China, you can stop digging," Augustus called after him. "That's the place where the men wear pigtails." "I wouldn't ride him if I were you," Call said. "We may need him." "And I didn't send him off to dig no well. Don't you know that that's an insult to his dignity? I'm surprised he went. Well, I thought Dish had more grit." "He said he'd stay," Call said. "I ain't feeding him 3 times a day to sit around and play cards with you." "No need to now," Augustus said. "I got Jake for that. I bet you don't get Jake down in your well." At that moment, Jake stepped out on the back porch, his sleeves rolled up and his face red from the scrubbing he had given it with an old piece of sacking they used for a towel. "That old pistolero's been cleaning his gun on this towel," Jake said. "It's filthy dirty. If it's just his 6-shooter he's cleaning on it, you oughtn't to complain," Augustus said. "There's worse things he could wipe on it." "Hell, don't you men ever wash?" Jake asked. "That old Mex didn't even want to give me a pan of water." It was the kind of remark Call had no patience with, but that was Jake, more interested in fancy arrangements than in the more important matters. "Once you left, our standards slipped," Augustus said. "The majority of this outfit ain't interested in refinements." "Well, that's plain," Jake said. "There's a damn pig on the back porch. Now, what about them biscuits?" Much as I missed you, I ain't overworking my sourdough just because you and Dietz couldn't manage to get here in time, Augustus said. What I will do is fry you some meat. He fried it. Jake and Dietz ate it, while Bolivar sat in the corner and sulked at the thought of 2 more breakfasts to wash up after. It amused Augustus to watch Jake eat. He was so fastidious about it, but the sight put Call into a black fidget. Jake could spend 20 minutes picking at some eggs and a bit of bacon. It was obvious to Augustus that Call was trying to be polite and let Jake get some food in his belly before he told his story. But Call was not a patient man and had already controlled his urge to get to work longer than was usual. He stood in the door watching the whitening sky and looking restless enough to bite himself. "So where have you been, Jake?" Augustus asked to speed things up. Jake looked thoughtful, as he almost always did. His coffee-colored eyes always seemed to be traveling leisurely over scenes from his own past, and they gave the impression that he was a man of sorrows, an impression very appealing to the ladies. It disgusted Augustus a little that the ladies were so taken by Jake's big eyes. In fact, Jake Spoon had had a perfectly easy life, doing mostly just what he pleased and keeping his boots clean. What his big eyes concealed was a slow-working brain. Basically, Jake just dreamed his way through life and somehow got by with it. "Oh, I've been seeing the country," he said. "I was up to Montana 2 years ago. I guess that's what made me decide to come back, although I've been meaning to get back down this way and see you boys for some years." Call came back in the room and straddled a chair, figuring he might as well hear it. "What's Montana got to do with us?" he asked. "Why, Call, you ought to see it," Jake said. "Prettier country never was." "Well, how far'd you go?" Augustus asked. "Way up past the Yellowstone," Jake said. "I was near to the Milk River. You can smell Kennedy from there." "I bet you can smell Indians, too," Call said. "How'd you get past the Cheyenne?" "They shipped most of them out," Jake said. "Some of the Blackfeet are still troublesome, but I was with the Army doing a little scouting." That hardly made sense. Jake Spoon might scout his way across a card table, but Montana was something else. "When'd you take to scouting?" Call asked dryly. "Oh, I was just with a feller taking some beef to the Blackfeet," Jake said. "The Army came along to help." "A lot of damn help the Army would be driving beef," Gus said. "They helped us keep our hair," Jake said, laying his knife and fork across his plate as neatly as if he were eating at a fancy table. "My main job was to scare the buffalo out of the way," he said. "Buffalo?" Augustus said. "I thought they was about all gone." "Pshaw," Jake said. "I must have seen 50,000 above the Yellowstone. The damn buffalo hunters ain't got the guts to take on them Indians. Oh, they'll finish 'em once the Cheyenne and the Sioux finally cave in. And they may have since I left. The damn Indians have the grass of Montana all to themselves. It has got grass. Call, you ought to see it." "I'd go today if I could fly," Call said. "It'd be safer to walk," Augustus said. "By the time we walked up there, maybe they would have licked the Indians." "That's just it, boys," Jake said. "The minute they're licked, there's going to be fortunes made in Montana. Why, it's cattle land like you've never seen it, Call. High grass and plenty of water." "Chilly, though, ain't it?" Augustus asked. "Oh, it's got weather," Jake said. "Hell, a man can wear a coat." "Better yet, a man can stay inside," Augustus said. "Well, I've yet to see a fortune made inside," Call said, "except by a banker, and we ain't bankers. What did you have in mind, Jake?" "Getting to it first," Jake said. "Round up some of these free cattle and take 'em on up. Beat all the other sons of bitches, and we'd soon be rich." Augustus and Call exchanged looks. It was odd talk to be hearing from Jake Spoon, who had never been known for his ambition, much less his fondness for cows. Pretty whores and pacing horses, and lots of clean shirts had been his main requirements in life. "Why, Jake, what reformed you?" Gus asked. "You was never a man to hanker after fortune. Living with cows from here to Montana would mean a change in your habits." If I remember 'em right, Call said. Jake grinned his slow grin. You boys, he said. You got me down for lazier than I am. I ain't no lover of cow shit and trail dust, I admit. But I've seen something that you haven't seen. Montana. Just because I like to play cards don't mean I can't smell an opportunity when one's right under my nose. Well, you boys ain't even got a barn with a roof on it. I doubt it would bust you to move. Jake, if you ain't something, Augustus said. Here we ain't seen hide nor hair of you for 10 years, and now you come riding in and want us to pack up and go north and get scalped? Well, Gus, me and Call are going bald anyway, Jake said. You're the only one whose hair they'd want. All the more reason not to carry it into a hostile land. Hostile land, Augustus said. Why don't you just calm down and play cards with me for a few days? Then when I've won all your money, we'll talk about going places. Jake whittled down a match and began to meticulously pick his teeth. By the time you clean me, Montana will be all settled up, he said. I don't clean quick. What about that horse, Call asked. You didn't gan him like that just so you could get here to help us beat the rush to Montana. What's this about your luck running thick? Jake looked a little more sorrowful as he picked his teeth. Killed the dentist, he said. Pure accident, but I killed him. Where'd this happen? Call asked. Fort Smith, Arkansas, Jake said. Not 3 weeks ago. Well, I've always considered dentistry a dangerous profession, Augustus said. Making a living by yanking people's teeth out is asking for trouble. He wasn't even pulling my tooth, Jake said. I didn't even know there was a dentist in town. I got in a little argument in the saloon, and a damn mule skinner threw down on me. Somebody's old buffalo rifle was leaning against the wall right by me, and that's what I went for. Hell, I was sitting on my own pistol. I never would have got to it in time. I wasn't even playing cards with a mule skinner. What riled him then? Gus asked. Whiskey, Jake said. He was bull drunk before I even noticed he took a dislike to my dress and pulled his colt. Well, I don't know what took you to Arkansas in the first place, Jake, Augustus said. Fancy dresser like yourself is bound to excite comment in them parts. Call had found over the years that it only did to believe half of what Jake said. Jake was not a bald liar, but once he thought over a scrape, his imagination sort of worked on it and shaded it in his own favor. If a man pointed a gun at you and you shot him, then that was self-defense, Call said. I still don't see where the dentist comes in. That was bad luck all around, Jake said. I never even shot the mule skinner. I did shoot, but I missed, which was enough to scare him off. But of course I shot that darn buffalo gun, and it was just a little plank saloon we were sitting in. The plank won't stop a 50 caliber bullet. Neither will a dentist, Augustus observed. Not unless you shoot down on him from the top, and even then I expect the bullet would come out his foot. Call shook his head. Augustus could think of the damnedest things. So where was the dentist, he asked. Walking along the other side of the street, Jake said. They got big wide streets in that town, too. But not wide enough, I guess, Call said. Nope, Jake said. We went to the door to watch the mule skinner run off and saw the dentist laying over there dead 50 yards away. He had managed to get in the exact wrong spot. P done the same thing once, Augustus said. You remember Woodrow? Up in the Wichita country? P shot at a wolf and missed, and the bullet went over a hill and killed one of our horses. I won't forget that, Call said. It was little Billy it killed. I hated to lose that horse. Of course, we couldn't convince P he'd done it, Augustus said. He don't understand trajectory. Well, I understand it, Jake said. Everybody in town liked that dentist. Oh, Jake, that won't stick, Augustus said. Nobody really likes dentists. Well, this one was the mayor, Jake said. Well, it was an accidental death, Call said. Yeah, but I'm just a gambler. They all like to think that they're respectable back in Arkansas. Besides, the dentist's brother was the sheriff, and somebody told him I was a gunfighter. He invited me to leave town a week before it happened. Call sighed. All the gunfighter business went back to one lucky shot Jake had made when he was a mere boy starting out in the Rangers. It was funny how one shot could make a man's reputation like that. It was a hip shot Jake made because he was scared, and it killed a Mexican bandit who was riding toward him on a dead run. It was Call's opinion, and Augustus's too, that Jake hadn't even been shooting at the bandit. It was probably shooting in hopes of bringing down the horse, which might have fallen on the bandit and crippled him a little, but Jake shot blind from the hip, with the sun in his eyes to boot, and hit that bandit right in the Adam's apple, a thing not likely to occur more than once in a lifetime, if that often. But it was Jake's luck that most of the men who saw him make the shot were raw boys too, with not enough judgment to appreciate how lucky a thing it was. Those that survived and grew up told the story all across the West, so there was hardly a man from the Mexican border to Canada who hadn't heard what a dead pistol shot Jake Spoon was, though any man who had fought with him through the years would know that he was no shot at all with a pistol, and only a fair shot with a rifle. Call and Augustus had always worried about Jake because of his unearned reputation, but he was a lucky fellow, and there were not many men around dumb enough to enjoy pistol fights, so Jake managed to get by. It was ironic that the shot which finally got him in trouble was as big an accident as the shot that made his fame. "How'd you get loose from the sheriff?" Call asked. "He was gone when it happened," Jake said. "He was up in Missouri testifying on some stage robbers. I don't know if he's even back in Fort Smith yet." "They wouldn't have hung you for an accident, even in Arkansas," Call said. "I am a gambler, but that's one I didn't figure to gamble on," Jake said. "I just went out the back door and left, hoping July would get too busy to come after me." "July is the sheriff?" Augustus asked. "Yes, July Johnson," Jake said. "He's young, but he's determined. I hope he gets busy." "I don't know why a lawman would want a dentist for a brother," Augustus said rather absently. "Well, if he warned you out of town, you should have left," Call said. "There's plenty of other towns besides Fort Smith." "Jake probably had him a whore," Augustus said. "He usually does." "You're one to talk," Jake said. They all fell silent for a time while Jake thoughtfully picked his teeth with the sharpened match. Bolivar was sound asleep sitting on a stool. "I should have rode on, Call," Jake said apologetically. "But Fort Smith's a pretty town. It's on the river, and I like to have a river running by me. They eat catfish down there. I got to where it kind of suited my tooth." "I'd like to see the fish that could keep me in a place I wasn't wanted," Call said. Jake had always been handy with excuses. "That's what we'll tell the sheriff when he shows up to take you back," Augustus said. "Maybe he'll take you fishing while you're waiting to be hung." Jake let it pass. Gus would have his joke, and he and Call would disapprove of him when he got in some unlucky scrape. It had always been that way. But the three of them were compañeros still, no matter how many dentists he killed. Call and Gus had been the law themselves and didn't always bow and scrape to it. They would not likely let some young sheriff take him off to hang just because of an accident. He was willing to take a bit of ribbing. When trouble came, if it did, the boys would stick and July Johnson would have to ride back home empty-handed. He stood up and walked to the door to look over the hot, dusty little town. "I hardly thought to find you boys still here," he said. "I thought you'd have some big ranch somewheres by now. This town was a two-bit town when we came here, and it looks to me like it's lost about 15 cents since then. Who's left that we all know?" "Xavier and Lippy," Augustus said. "Teresa got killed, thank God. Few of the boys are left, but I forgot who. Tom Bynum's left." "He would be," Jake said. "The Lord looks after fools like Tom." "What do you here, Clara?" Augustus asked. "I suppose since you've traveled the world, you've been to see her. Dropped in for supper, innocent-like, I guess." Call stood up to go. He had heard enough to know why Jake had come back. He didn't intend to waste the day listening to him jaw about his travels, particularly not if it meant having to hear any talk about Clara Allen. He had heard enough about Clara in the old days when Gus and Jake had both been courting her. He had been quite happy to think it all ended when she married, but it hadn't ended, and listening to Gus pine over her was almost as bad as having him and Jake fighting about her. Now, with Jake back, it would all start again, though Clara Allen had been married and gone for over 15 years. Dietz stood up when called did, ready for work. He hadn't said a word while eating, but it was clear that he took much pride in being the one who had seen Jake first. "Well, it ain't a holiday," Call said. "Work to do. Me and Dietz will go see if we can help them boys." "That newt surprised me," Jake said. "I had it in mind that he was still a spud. Is Maggie still here?" "Maggie's been dead for 9 years," Augustus said. "You wasn't hardly over the hill when it happened." "I swear," Jake said. "You mean you've had little Newt for 9 years?" There was a long silence in which only Augustus felt comfortable. Dietz felt so uncomfortable that he stepped in front of the captain and went out the door. "Why, yes, Jake. We've had him since Maggie died." "I swear," Jake said again. "It was the only Christian thing. Taking him in, I mean. After all, one of you boys is more than likely his pa." Call put on his hat, picked up his rifle, and left them to their talk.